The magnetic field of the earth, of course, must be understood by you because every man knows what the North Pole is. The earth is tilted very slightly on its axis, and it contains a magnetic field. The lines of force are not important to us here today, but earth, not only men but every living organism. And one would expect that if an organism lived for 200 million years, or even only 20 million years in a magnetic field, if that magnetic field was altered in any way, he would be some way different. We have evolved in a magnetic field. When I say evolved, I don't mean just your age of 30 years or 60 years or whatever it is. I mean we, the human race, has evolved within the magnetic field of the earth, has evolved out of savagery in ancient Lemuria, through emotionalism in Atlantis, and into mentalism of the Aryan root race, our present root race. And all this has occurred within the magnetic field of the earth. Why has this extraordinary person, this controversial figure, Dr. Baker, chosen to investigate magnetism of all things? And that's what the People newspaper had to say of me. Why magnetism? I chose magnetism because magnetism is the beloved of the gods. The adepts, the masters say that the aura is magnetic. It is not based on the energy of light or heat, though these are its properties. The aura is magnetic, and magnetism is the beloved of the gods. And therefore, I was able to assume, and later have this corroborated by the English master, that an investigation of magnetism and its effects was most important for our own particular stage of evolution of our root race. The time has come to investigate magnetism sanely, for it lies at the basis of the aura, and therefore, ladies and gentlemen, every phenomenon of an occult or esoteric nature is based on magnetism. If we are talking about astrology, if we are talking about esoteric healing, if we are talking about mantrams, if we are talking about any possible esoteric phenomenon, we are dealing with the energy of magnetism. And of all the energies, you would expect this to be so, of all the energies, magnetism was the one that is least understood. It is least understood partly because it has grown up in an atmosphere of fear and suspicion and distrust. And the distrust has arisen because men in earlier days could not rationalize, could not say how magnetism worked. They would observe how one stone would draw another stone to it, and that little stone would draw a further stone to it, so that a man could pick up a whole string of stones that were suspended in midair, touching each other. And they marveled at this. And they noticed how there was attraction between two magnetic objects. And this attraction they couldn't help feeling was an aspect, a manifestation of love, because love attracts. And so there grew up the belief that the attraction of man for woman, the attraction of one person to another, was magnetic in origin. And of course they were partly right, because we have never understood magnetism. Later, when science came along and said, yes, but it attracts because of this, it is a feature of the molecular structure of iron that there the attraction occurs, then of course science was able to say how ridiculous to suggest that magnetism lies at the basis of the attraction between man and woman, between two individuals. And in fact, Paracelsus, who was the real first of the psychiatrists, the modern psychiatrists, Paracelsus evolved this belief in the magnetic attraction between two people, and he began to write what we would call the first books in psychiatry. Attraction and repulsion. We are repelled by certain people because we are magnetically opposed to them. Now this is all palpable nonsense to science. But at the basis of it all, there is a stream of truth. And I was determined to get not to the bottom of it. I knew that that was impossible, but that I could break into this field and bring some light into it. You see, If we could give a rationale to astrology, astrology could be investigated by computers. If somebody could say how astrology worked then, that would be a wonderful thing. Because then science would look at astrology. They would be able to set great computers onto it and be able to forecast certain trends in the Earth's development which were related to other situations in other magnetic fields. We are living in a magnetic field, which is the Earth. There are other extraordinary magnetic fields about us. Science will say the magnetic field of the sun is so weak as not to affect living tissue. But of course the magnetic fields of the sun do affect living tissue. Every 11 years the solar magnetic storms reach the Earth, of course, and they affect the living cells of the xylem of trees. And in the annular rings of trees you can count every 11 years an aberration, giving a different ring on the tree, indicating that the xylem cells are responsive to the magnetic forces of the sun. So magnetism can affect living things, and may do this psychically. Then there is the magnetic field of the moon. People will say, well, this is gravitational pull. But in some way or the other, we know that the moon affects living organisms in extraordinary ways. We believe that magnetism has something to do with the orientation of birds and of other insects to their homing. In the South Sea Islands, the palola worm swarms on the beaches around the full moon of Libra at no other time of the year. But some hours, a day, 2 days before the moon is full in Libra, there is a stirring of these worms, the palola worms, and they make their way to the beaches only before the Libra full moon and swarm on the South Sea beaches. There is much evidence to show that living things are responsive to magnetism. But it is very difficult to show that the weak magnetic field of Jupiter can affect me, because we have only got physical instruments to measure the physical body. But we are gathered here at this festival to understand things about man. We have to understand, of course, that man has other bodies. When I talked to you about the powers latent in man, I was not talking about the powers of this physical sheath, this almost inert entity which we call the physical body. I was talking about other aspects of man. I was talking about man's astral body, the body of astral substance that interpenetrates his physical nature, that astral body into which our consciousness slips when we go to sleep, and that astral body which we learn to move away from the physical in search of targets, of people, of places that we want to be with. And in the dream state, we wander in our consciousness in our astral bodies. When we awaken, the astral body goes back into alignment with the physical. I shall be giving workshops here in the next few days, teaching how to project the astral body and how to do it purposefully, and why this is a very useful function, a very creative function. And when I talk about the effects of the magnetic fields of Jupiter, the effects of the magnetic fields of the moon and Mars and Uranus and far-flung Pluto, I'm talking about magnetic fields that affect not just the physical body, but the astral body and the astral magnetic field. I talk about magnetic fields affecting the mental body, even subtler than this. I'd love a piece of blue chalk if somebody could find it. Oh, here we have it. Yeah. Thank you. I am talking about the total spectrum of man's nature. If you study the masters and their teachings, they will tell you that disease is only 1/10 dependent on the physical body, that occasionally physical disease per se occurs, but only 1/10 of all disease is a manifestation through the defection of physical cells per se. The masters, and they are corroborated by men like George Delawarr and many others working today on this planet with Kirlian photography, the teachings of the masters is that disease is mainly of emotional origin. That upsets in the emotional body, persisted with, will ultimately find their way out in physical disorders. Similarly so, but less so, with the mental nature. And so when we talk about magnetism and subtle magnetism as in astrology, we are talking about fields that affect the inner spectrum of man's bodies. And therefore we can see that magnetism lies at the basis of esoteric healing. And you can flounder around with your esoteric healing. You can play around with color and sound and every other aspect of it. But in the end, to understand the forces at work, you will need to understand biomagnetism. We are talking about subtle forces at play here. Let's consider another esoteric science, radionics. I have yet to hear a radionic expert explain the rationale behind radionics. Oh, certainly I hear how wonderful they are at the science, but how few of them will contribute their marvelous knowledge to an unfolding of a rationale. For if we could get a rationale to radionics, goodness me, we would soon have science helter-skeltering to a thorough investigation of it. You know what radionics is? You can take the blood spot of a person in New York and you can send it to Great Britain. Or if you like, and it makes you more pleased, we can send a blood spot from England to the United States, but that would be a very, very much rarer phenomenon. A blood spot sent from the United States to Great Britain could be analyzed here. That does not mean to say we could say that this blood spot comes from a human being, or this blood spot contains the elements of cancer. No. What we could say is that that blood spot can be analyzed radionically, and by that we talk about its pre-physical condition. We are talking about forces of etheric substance, mental and emotional substance, hovering over the pre-physical condition of that blood spot. And when we take that blood spot and put it into the well of our radionic instrument, lie it there and orientate it, we have standing next to it a bar magnet. In a good radionic instrument, and you have to be sure where you're buying them, you have a bar magnet very, very near to the blood spot placed in the well. And the blood spot is, as it were, got to be made en rapport with the magnet. And so you twirl the magnet until it gives a critical position with the blood spot. There's the North Pole, there's the South Pole, you rotate the magnet. And all the phenomena of radionics, the subsequent locating of pre-physical disease conditions in the person who is 6,000 miles away in Hawaii or elsewhere on the moon, you are locating his radionic condition, his pre-physical condition. He may not have a cancer observable or measurable in terms of physical instruments, but there may be a cancer building up in pre-physical substance. And that is what radionics does say it can do. And remember that radionics has stood the test of the High Court of Great Britain. Never forget it. It was the sacrifice of a man and woman, the Delawarrs of Oxford, that has made radionics safe in this country, and we hope safe one day in all parts of the world. They had the courage to take their case to the High Court of Great Britain rather than fight it in a magistrate's court, for they were sued for fraud. One of their boxes was bought by a woman who we believe was egged on by the BMA, the British Medical Association. She sued for fraud. Delawarr tried to return her money. She would not have it. She wanted his blood. He took the case rather when she sued for fraud to the High Court, and Christmas Humphreys, who is the head of the Buddhist movement in Great Britain, defended Delawarr, and his case was thrown out. Judge Davies, I think it was, said that he could not agree that the Delawarrs had fraudulently set out to fool the public or whoever they had sold their instruments to. Radionics must have a bar magnet near the blood spot. And when the radionic camera was used, when For instance, and we can one day see some of these slides, when the blood spot of a person, a woman who was pregnant, 50 miles away, say in Manchester, when that blood spot was sent to London and the magnetic instrument, the radionic instrument, was set up for 3 months pregnancy, a photograph was taken of the auric emanation of the blood spot, and the photograph revealed a 3 months pregnancy, merely from photographing the blood spot. And so we see that magnetism seems to lie at the basis of many phenomena, the occult phenomena. It is said to be the basis of hypnotism. It is said to be the basis of telepathy and many other of the esoteric sciences. And so it was with this background that we began to investigate the effects of magnetism on the human body. I myself had been doing some research into the history of medicine in Sheffield University. I had studied ancient manuscript books ancient manuscripts on the subject in the Wellcome Library, not a mile from here. And I was staggered in my research to see how often the subject of magnetism was mentioned in ancient medicine. Magnets were greatly prized in the old days. They were used to treat a variety of conditions, conditions of the blood, conditions of the eyes, and so on. Paracelsus ground up magnets, or ferritite, or magnetite I should say, into tiny little particles and used it in ointments to put into the appalling wounds that he dressed as an army surgeon in the 100 Years' War, and marveled at the way that the magnetism assisted in wound healing. We have many, many examples of it being used in ancient days, and I was very, very staggered by the way in which magnetism was used by so many old cultures. And I said that one day I would do what I could to investigate the subject rationally. And then I knew George Delawarr very well. I'd had him up to Sheffield University to speak to the students there. And we teamed up and agreed that we would investigate the effects of magnetism. George Delawarr had evolved a very strange instrument. It was called a reflexograph. He didn't dare think that he was, as it were, measuring the aura with it, but I have no doubt in my mind that the aura contributed to it. What he did was to pass, as it were, a sound wave through the wrist of the person. There would be the wrist, and a sound wave would be passed through the wrist, a sine wave. In passing through the wrist, this sine wave would lose some of its energy and would then adopt a new pattern as it emerged from the wrist. And we found that we could get this pattern again and again with this machine as it settled down, but the moment that you started to introduce things into the aura of that person, that wave began to alter. Even though the person didn't know you were doing it, the wave would alter slightly. Thus, if you were, for instance, to, let's start off with sound, play music to that individual and change the music, say from classical music to jazz, there would be immediate change in the energy pattern given out from his wrist, the sound energy being passed through it. We went on with various colors and other experiments to see how these would affect the individual, and then we began to use magnets, and we found that even though you brought a bar magnet near to the kidneys of the patient at the back, in his back, that even though he didn't know the bar magnet was there, immediately there was a change in this energy output. And we began to understand that magnetism really does affect the physical body in ways which science had not yet discovered. With his magnificent brain, his expertise, his ability to produce sensitive instruments, Delawarr evolved an instrument that I'm going to show you in a moment. And this was an instrument that could produce magnetic fields, measurable magnetic fields. Everything that I talk about from now on is to do with measurable magnetism. Measurable magnetism. There's nothing hocus pocus. There's no suggestion that magnetism is coming from something. It is measurable. And he produced an instrument that as it were, evolved pulsating magnetic fields. We know that the Earth's magnetic field pulsates, not just a constant field, but a pulsating field, according to the other magnetic effects of the planets, the sun, and so on. We know that if a man lifts up a heavy bucket and holds this bucket with a weight of, say, 20 pounds for several hours, perhaps 2 or 3 days, his arm will waste. But if he picks the bucket up and puts it down, and picks it up and puts it down, the muscles will hypertrophy, they will grow, they will strengthen. And so we began to experiment with magnetic fields that pulsated. They pulsated. And we used, obviously, what equipment we had available. Electricity, which came off the wall, pulsates at 50 cycles a second, as you know. Delawarr elaborated an instrument which produced pulsating magnetic fields based on sound waves. Now, you know that a sound wave has so many frequencies to a second. Middle C, which is the first, should be the first sound, the first letter of the Om should be middle C. And that should be 256 cycles. I think it varies a little in America. I have my scientific consultant here, and he nodded his head, so that's all right. 256 cycles per second. In a second, this sound wave has 256 cycles. 261 in America. How dare you? All right. 261 cycles. So we began then to produce an instrument which had a tape deck, and the tape could have any sound on it that we wanted. And so when we played the tape, it gave off a certain sound. There was the box and there was the tape deck. We could select our tapes. And so coming from this machine, there was a sound. We converted the sound of this magnetic head into electrical impulses, so that instead of our getting 50 cycles off the wall, we were now able to get any number of cycles of electricity from this tape according to the sound that we had on it. If it was middle C, it would give us an electrical current oscillating at 256 cycles a second. If the current was drawn out of it, we therefore had an electrical current oscillating at 256. All we had to do was to spiral it into an air-cored solenoid, and we had a magnetic field pulsating at 256 cycles a second. And here is one of these particular magnetic fields. In other words, if I was to plug this jack plug into a socket here and play the Om, or play 256 cycles, could you sound that for us, Commander? You will in a moment. If we were to plug in there, we would be getting a magnetic field which was pulsating at 256 cycles a second. Not this one. I meant your screamer. Would be pulsating at 256 cycles a second, which meant this. We could control the quality of the magnetism. If the magnetism was, in fact, to pulsate at 256 cycles a second, we eventually learnt that this had a very beneficial effect on muscular tissue. There we have these. Thank you very much. That was the main sound that we were to use. Why did we choose that? Was it because it was the first sound of the Om, or was it because from occult facts we know that the sound of the solar system is middle C, and the solar logos's note is middle C, and if middle C could correct that which was not middle C, then surely that would bring solar health back to the individual. And so we then began to elaborate an instrument which was capable of producing not one but many magnetic fields. Perhaps 8 in a row. 8 of these might come from an instrument like this. I can't go any further. You'll have to lift that, Commander. Can you show it to the audience? And so this was the tape deck that we had. All right, I've got it. The tape deck. And here was the sockets, 8 of them in this particular instrument, which gave out magnetic fields. We were then able to place these magnetic fields strategically and on anatomical sites of the body. It was then that Mrs. Delawarr, Marjorie Delawarr, who is a magnificent radionics operator, came into the picture. She was able to locate by radionic means the correct vibration or the correct oscillating magnetic field for the organ of the body. And we were able, by means of radionics, to find where to place the magnetic fields. We had to have sessions in which we sat down and said, we are going to work out now the magnetic fields and the places to place the magnetic fields, the anatomical sites. We're going to work out a scheme for lowering the blood pressure or lowering the blood cholesterol, which kills most people. We had to work this out, and we would have a session in which we would think of nothing but low blood pressure and the symptoms of low blood pressure and everything to do with it. And Mrs. Delawarr would gradually pick up the feeling of what low blood pressure was, or she would pick up the sensation of high cholesterol. I would read extracts from medical books on the subject, think about it carefully, and eventually she would be ready. And then she would, by means of her radionic instrument, locate these anatomical sites. We would go over a body, we'd go over the body of a living person, of course, and locate, by radionic means, places that were sensitive to high cholesterol, especially in certain parts of the body that I'm going to describe in a moment. And out of all this, ladies and gentlemen, there evolved a method, a whole new method of medical treatment, the application of magnetic fields to the human body.
You want to bring the tone now?
Yes. Would you like to hear the variety of tones that we used? And you'll begin to understand the magnificence of this particular field of medicine. We could select any of these sounds. All the time you could be going over the sounds with a radionic instrument, and when that patient and the sound were en rapport, and his rhythm and the sound were en rapport, and the magnetic field was right, you'd get a stick, a loud stick. And then we would have that sound immediately recorded. Thank you.
That was 2 octaves.
2 octaves, yes. So now you're beginning to get some picture of how magnetic fields were used in this particular case. If you are esotericists, basically, you will begin to understand that these sounds have relationships. Middle C is related to the planet Sun. Fa, do, re, mi, fa, and the same octave is related to the planet Saturn, is related to the thyroid gland, is related to the color green, is related to the plant kingdom, and so on, to iodine, etc. And so we began to feel that we were on to a science that was going to link up the esoteric methods of healing with the exoteric. Magnetism is something that you have to observe functioning. Once you start talking about theories and magnetism, you get lost, and it is only theory. Practically nothing is known about the nature of magnetism, despite virtually centuries of scientific observation. And so we are thrown back onto the effects of the magnetism. And even in the realm of effects, we are still on relatively unsure ground. If you still go into the physics departments of our high schools in England, they would raise their eyebrows there if you suggested for one moment that magnets could affect living tissue. Nevertheless, there is a huge and increasing body of opinion which suggests that magnetic effects are felt at the mental and emotional level. You have some current bestsellers on the subject. I'm trying to think of the woman's book, Something in the Brain. Just gone out of my mind for the moment. But there are numerous effects now being registered on the effect of magnetic storms, for instance. Magnetic storms on the face of the sun producing a greater number of entrances into psychiatric clinics during that period. Of course, man has grown up in the magnetic field of the earth. It's a weak magnetic field. It's practically a pulsating field. It is a field that has had somehow something to do with our evolution. And if we can vary magnetic fields of a weak nature similar to the Earth's, it may be possible, and this is our proposition, to affect the mental and emotional outlook of the patient and possibly alter the pre-physical matrix or the etheric body of the individual. We're not suggesting for one moment that magnetism is suitable for producing dramatic physical effects in the body. You won't find them. There are no dramatic physical effects of magnetism in the physical body. But we have done extensive research work, certainly not entirely scientific. And in 1966, George Delawarr and I began to work seriously on the subject of magnetism. I had always been interested in it because I was an occultist, and I knew that magnetism was the beloved of the gods, the beloved energy of the gods. I also knew that underlying all psychic phenomena, occult phenomena, there is a magnetic factor. The human aura is magnetic. The only possible way of accounting for the phenomenon of astrology at this stage is that it is a magnetic phenomenon. We have begun to learn in the last 10 days that the influence of the archetypes is almost certainly what is implied by esoteric astrology. Esoteric astrology plotting, suggesting the effects of archetypal energies in man. But in the end, it all comes down to trial and error, to practice, to application of the fields, and observing the effects of them, And this is what Delawarr and I did for a period of about 4 years. We gave numerous treatments, and you will see in the next week, in 10 days, most of those instruments here. They'll be on demonstration. A little later on, you can creep in and watch people being magnetically treated. I will take you around and show you what is being done. I will also show you how you can treat just about all the conditions that you're likely to come across: arthritis, eczema, psoriasis, high blood pressure, general stress manifestations which show up as imbalance or an upset of homeostasis, and so on. And you can see all this for yourselves. And so really this talk is merely to introduce the subject to you, and on Monday and Wednesday you're going to see elaborated in detail and for your observation many of the phenomena that I'm going to describe now when you go to the Delawarr Laboratories. There is a science based on magnetism known as radionics. It began to evolve under the guidance of a Dr. Abrams of San Francisco round about the turn of the century. And he was an individual who noted a resonance existing between force fields and specific parts in man's body. Many of you throw away the best hours of your day in sleep, needless amounts of sleep, and worse than that, those periods in which you do sleep are the very periods of sensitivity when you could note for yourselves the phenomena of such things as radionics. There's many a phenomenon that I have noted and taken up which has occurred in the silence of the night, quietness of the night. Some of you don't even know the sounds of your own body, and never heard the rush of blood in the carotid artery in your ears, and never heard the gentle movements of the bowel and how those movements can be subtly affected by your environment. I remember lying quietly one evening, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and noting that I could hear my watch. It's a good watch, a very, very quiet tick. And I haven't got outstanding hearing. But place the watch on a sounding board, and that tick can become enormous, and it can penetrate your consciousness. And I was quietly listening to the sound of the ticking of this watch lying next to my bed, and something moved in the watch. I heard a noise. It's a self-winding watch. Something moved in it. And that slight movement in the watch set off a borborygma in my belly. And I heard the little tinkling noise of the watch, and immediately it triggered off, 2 feet away, a movement in the bowel, and it was definitely correlated. And it is that sort of rapport at the most sensitive levels that is monitored, is the basis, if you like, of the science of radionics. That a magnetic field pulsating or placed in a certain position or rotated can be en rapport with parts of the body. I have, as Dr. Kaczynski would tell you, and like most people have, slight bone malformation from old hockey accidents in my right foot, and I suffer a degree of osteoarthritis from standing and lecturing and going on tour and so on. And I noticed that when I cross my legs in bed round or near the ankles, that the left ankle, which is the sound one, parasitizes the right ankle, draws energy off from the right ankle. And this is a phenomenon that you could watch for yourself, that a healthy part will often parasitize an unhealthy part. Why? Because the unhealthy part is in a state of instability. Its energies are motile. They flow around, especially at an etheric level. And I mention this particular aspect because the body is magnetic. The body is magnetic. And on some occasions, the crossing of the legs can be a situation that upsets the magnetic forces and produces flow. Now, this sort of phenomenon is of no particular interest to you because you have not gone into the field of magnetism, especially biomagnetism, but it was to us. It was to us. And so our first efforts, Delawarr, were to see if there really was a response of the body to the proximity of a magnet. And Delawarr, an expert in putting together instruments for the detection of subtle energies, had elaborated a device which could pass sound waves through tissues. You could set the sound wave up, could pass it through the wrist, and then you could pick up the sound wave after it had passed through the wrist. It had lost energy by then, and the sound wave was therefore altered somewhat. The sound wave was altered somewhat by being passed through the wrist. And it meant that we had some sort of indicator of the effect of impacting the body with an energy, in this case sound. So sound waves could be passed through the tissue of the knee or the wrist. We could register a pattern, and that pattern we would eventually get absolutely set and regular. Then you could irradiate that individual with a color. You could bathe them in a green light. And the moment that you did this, there would be a change in the energy uptake. There would be a change in the energy uptake. The effect of being bathed in the blue light or the green light altered the energy uptake. We're not saying that there weren't reflexes going on in the body that could partly account for that, but it was a phenomenon that Delawarr charted with holograms thousands and thousands and thousands of times. I have many of these holograms in my own possession. Down at Oxford you could ask to see them and they would be able to fish out thousands of them. And so here was a device which I thought was quite important, which showed the energy reaction of an individual confronted with changes in his environment. You get the environment stable, get a nice regular wave registered, and then you could change the environment. You could play classical music or jazz. You could irradiate him with one color or a variety or combination. At the Delawarr Laboratories you will see a color mixer there. They can mix colors in 100,000 combinations. And so they were able to expose color, or rather expose a patient or a subject to any kind of colors. There then remained for us to start using magnetism to see whether there was any reaction to magnetism. So we would have the subject in one room, and we would have an instrument producing a magnetic field, generating a magnetic field in another room, and the bar magnet, or whatever it was, placed behind the patient or the subject so that he couldn't see it. And even if he knew it was there, he wouldn't know when it was switched on and it was functioning. And we found that by placing magnets near the individual didn't know when it was on or off, that we would get alterations in this picture of energy uptake. And so by these methods we were able to detect that something happened in the body when magnets were placed near it, even though the patient was quite unaware as to when they were functioning. And then after that we went on into an investigation of the effects of magnetic fields when they were placed directly on the body, not just creating a magnetic field near it, but fighting the magnetic field. Before we go into that, let us consider what the Delawarrs have done with radionics. If you take their radionic diagnostic instrument to pieces, you find that they're made up mainly of a set of resistors, which are coils of wire. I think they're copper wire. And you and I, in the field of the occult, know that shapes are important, that all shapes are accumulators of energy. We may not be able to measure the energy yet, but we do know that it's true. We know that the pyramid accumulates energy by virtue of its structure, especially if it is oriented to the north-south magnetic pole of the Earth. We know that the pyramid accumulates certain energies, whether the pyramid is made of marble or metal or tissue paper, or even made out of a visual image in the mind. It's valid for all of these. Visualize a pyramid and you are creating an energy reservoir inside of you. So experimentation has been conducted to find out which shapes and forms tend to be the best accumulators of energy. Lokosovsky took a piece of wire and curved it once and hooked it onto a piece of stick and stuck it around a plant. And the plant did much better than other plants, merely for having this coil of wire about it. Somehow or the other, it accumulated, stored energy which could be drawn off by the plant itself. We have studied in the Jewel and the Lotus. You've heard from me many times talk about the effects of energy in pyramids, the first ray energy contained in spheres, like the sphere of the sun, the disk of the sun anyway, the outer disk of the sun, and the energy contained in cubes, the energies of the first, the second, and the third ray archetypes. This is what you should already have begun to think of in your mind, that certain shapes will channel the archetypal patterns of energy that we have been hearing about now for nearly 10 days. But the most effective of all the shapes from the point of view of accumulating energy, turned out to be a spiral, diminishing spiral or helix. And many have observed that this is true. And so what Delawarr did was to set up an instrument in which there were several rows of these spirals, and I think, if I remember rightly, he called them resistors. And each had a dial on top of it. A dial, there's the dial. And they were sunk in such a way that the dials could point to numbers, 1 to 100 or 1 to 10 or whatever they were. And the whole platform of these were placed and related to each other. The energies from them were all centered. Then it merely was needed to relate a blood spot, which after all, if you have studied Esoteric Healing Part 2 of my book, a blood cell is itself a shape, it's a biconcave disc, it's an energy accumulator, and the whole blood spot is an energy field. So what he was requiring was to try and relate a blood spot, which is the mechanism of detection, the medium of detection in radionics. He was trying to relate a blood spot to energy fields. The way in which he did it was to have a well here and a well there, and you could place the blood spot in either one of these wells. And the way in which he coordinated everything was to have a bar magnet, a little round magnet, if you like that, a bar magnet on the end of a dial, and this bar magnet would be giving out its force field, which would flood, obviously, the blood spot, and also the resistors in the energy fields, and that it was the magnet that enabled the variable energies of the resistors. You could turn them completely around, each one of them, and they were gradated. It could relate the energy fields of the resistors with the blood spot. And so it would be possible, conceivably possible, to find out when the resistor's energy had a rapport, a resonance, or was in resonance with the field of the blood spot. And the detection mechanism, once that is achieved, that is a relating of the energy fields with the energy field of the blood spot, and you're left with a reading on each of the dials, say 264.4682, that would be the reading of the dials. That reading would merely be assessing the position in which the resistors were reflecting the nature of the blood spot. And the way in which this was assessed was to have a stick pad. We're going to see one in a moment, a stick pad of rubber, which would register a change in the electrical potential of the skin. Now that's no great deal. Lie detectors register changes in the electrical potential of the skin. And so the stick pad is a smooth piece of rubber in a framework on a diaphragm, which, when stroked, allows the fingers to flow across it But when there is resonance between the individual who is operating the machine, and by that we mean the individual's thoughts or his aura or whatever it is, again we're not sure of the exact theory of it, but where there is resonance or rapport between the individual's diagnosis and the actual state of the blood, the fingers get caught slightly on the rubber pad and a loud stick can be heard. It varies from individual to individual. Certainly Marjorie Delawarr produces very clear reactions in this direction. I remember almost every week we would have very important people coming down to the Delawarr Laboratories. The laboratories were famous, of course, and it was hardly a week that went by without either a cabinet minister or some lord or some doctor or coming down to look over things there. I remember on one occasion I had brought somebody down, very special person down, and was most anxious that he be impressed, and he wasn't impressed until Mrs. Delawarr asked him to find the radionic reading for arthritis, and he looked up in the book they provide with the rate for arthritis, and he set up the dials for arthritis, and he was asked to pass his fingers over the stick pad. Of course he got nothing, until Mrs. Delawarr put her 2 fingers into the well, and a loud stick went off, because Mrs. Delawarr has arthritis. And so the moment she placed her blood in the well, in a radionic instrument set up for the diagnostic rate for arthritis, this skeptic got the loud stick. She took her fingers away, the stick disappeared. Which only goes to illustrate what I've been saying, and that is that the diagnostic instrument is meant to assess the radionic pattern of a blood spot, and therefore of the patient thousands of miles away. The radionic proposition is that you and your blood is en rapport. If you study my Esoteric Healing, Book 2, I have gone into great detail about that. We're all made in the image of God. God to us is the one in whom we live and move and have our being. That's what the postulates in the Jewel and the Lotus are all about. And because in Him we live and move and have our being, and because we are a reflection of Him, then we are en rapport with Him, and in fact, in meditation we achieve this. We achieve rapport completely with the higher being. Similar circumstances govern your blood. Your blood is made up of minor lives. They live within you, and they are en rapport with you, resonant with you. If you change, they change. And even if you take the blood out of an individual, there is a continuum that links them together. I think that's postulate 4 of the Jewel and the Lotus. There is still a continuum that links them. And if you have an arthritic condition, then your blood spot will reflect the radionic, pre-physical energy rate for that condition. And if you get well, the blood spot emanations change, even though it may be thousands of miles away from you. And so, if you put a blood spot, or hair, or saliva, or any body part into the instrument, it will be a reflection of the individual at a distance. You are then able, by means of altering these force fields, to find out what sort of energy patterns are being radiated from the host, the patient, via his blood spot into your machine.